A crushing defeat, the president remained supreme. On this day in history, November 3rd, 1964, sitting President Lyndon B. Johnson defeated Republican hopeful Barry Goldwater Sr. in the general election for President of the United States. President Johnson won more than 60% of the popular vote, turning away the Republican senator and securing his first full term in office after being sworn in as president after the assassination of JFK. With stellar approval ratings and shining legislative success, Lyndon Johnson's spot as the Democratic nominee was a no-brainer. Coupled with the VP pick of Hubert Humphrey, a liberal senator from Minnesota, the ticket had geographic and ideological balance that appealed to voters. On the other side, the Republican Party was a contested fight for the nomination. The division was between the old guard moderate base and the conservative insurgents from the South and West. Barry Goldwater, the deeply conservative senator from Arizona, came out of the pack with the promise to reorient the party rightward, and in his own words, offer a choice, not an echo, for conservatives everywhere. However, the campaigns run by both candidates were utterly different. Goldwater alienated much of his party, as only 1/5 of the voters were comfortable with him being the nominee. His slogan, "In your heart, you know he's right," had an undertone that people voting for him may be ashamed to do so. For the Democrats, Johnson campaigned almost perfectly, counteracting Goldwater's slogan with eventful, thoughtful television ads, whereas Goldwater's was outdated and didn't appeal to the broad base of voters across the country. LBJ portrayed himself as a moderate, a peacemaker, and painted Goldwater as a warmonger who would bring the world to nuclear annihilation if he were elected. When the general election concluded and the votes were tallied, Johnson won the Electoral College by a 10-1 margin and more than the majority of the popular vote. Only in the Deep South was Goldwater able to win, and that was on the back of pushing back against Johnson's support for the Civil Rights Act and his idea to integrate schools, communities, and even businesses for all people. Although Johnson was able to work on and even pass most of the campaign promises he made, one plagued his political career for the rest of history. He claimed that he would not send American troops to fight in Vietnam, a statement that brought hope to many Americans, but a statement that he had to eat when he committed U.S. troops to combat just 4 months later.